October 28th, 1922. On that day, Benito Mussolini, following the coup d'etat of the March on Rome, took the reins of Italy. From then on, fascism began to spread throughout Europe. Yes, we've heard it all before. Fascism was the great villain of the 20th century. Hitler, Franco, Mussolini. But can you tell me what exactly the economic ideology of each one was? Were they left-wing, right-wing, libertarian? This is not a simple question. For example, Franco was a staunch defender of state-owned enterprises, limits on banking, and price controls. If he were alive today, most of us would think he was a leftist. But on the other hand, Hitler was a promoter of crony capitalism with private companies, something that, on the contrary, is normally identified with the right. Now then, Mussolini. Well, the history of Mussolini is something that will drive you crazy. Until 1914, he was a high official of the Italian Socialist Party. When he came to power, he completely changed course and privatized so many state-owned enterprises that he would make Javier Milei look like a lukewarm social democrat. But later on, he changed tack again and implemented a new economic model called corporatism, which was simply a strange mix between capitalism and socialism. And the question many of you may be wondering is, can fascism really be attributed to a particular economic model? The answer is yes, or at least if we stick to Italian fascism, because many historians argue that neither Franco nor Hitler were true fascists, and that is what would explain their apparent discrepancies in public policies. So what exactly does fascist economic ideology consist of? How did Mussolini change the Italian economy? What was behind his ideological shifts between Marxism, privatization, and corporatism? Well, today on Visualeconomik, we tell you all about it. So let's start with a question. Who is the man on the screen? Yep, this is Benito Mussolini. Although, take note, it's not the Mussolini we all know. It is his young and socialist version from 1903. That photo was taken by the Italian police on the day the future dictator was arrested and expelled from his country for being a communist agitator. We could say that the Duce was almost more left-wing than Stalin himself. To which, of course, you may be wondering, at what point did the tables turn? When did Mussolini stop being a Marxist? The answer lies in the First World War. The Italian Socialist Party clearly positioned itself against the conflict. They defended neutrality. The problem was that Mussolini advocated just the opposite. He was a radical who could not take a back seat in such an international conflict. In fact, according to his biography, even his own comrades were frightened of his radicalism. And keep in mind that we are talking about Marxists here, not exactly shrinking violets in terms of being radicals. The fact is that following several internal disputes, Mussolini ended up expelled from the party, and as it could not be otherwise, he sought revenge. After that, he founded the Italian Fighting Fascists, a new political movement designed to fight against his former socialist comrades in the 1919 elections. And in case you're wondering, yes, the word fasci is the precursor to the word fascism. Be that as it may, the question is, what was the result of the elections? Did the Duce get his revenge on his former comrades? Well, as you can imagine, things were not going to be that simple. The result was an absolute disaster. The fascist party did not win a single seat, but the socialists did very well. Remember that after the First World War, Italy was ruined. The country was devastated by the conflict. And which party had been against the war from the beginning? Indeed, the Socialist Party. So after the dissatisfaction of the war, the Italians rushed en masse to vote for them. They captured 30% of the national vote in 1919. However, it was just at this moment that the story took another 180-degree turn. Following the incredible rise in popularity of the Socialist Party, the Italian bourgeoisie saw the Red Terror of communism as being closer than ever. And faced with that, the right and centre-right parties, led by the Fascist Party, joined forces to fight the threat. And take note, because here the right had an advantage. Don't ask me why, but historically the extreme left parties have been characterized by their countless internal battles. Trotsky versus Stalin, or Mao versus Schaukey. Anyway, the Marxist parties are like a passionate soap opera, and not surprisingly, in Italy the same thing happened. The Socialist Party soon split, but the right wing, led by the fascists, remained united as never before. The result, in 1924, the Fascist Party coalition swept 64% of the vote. Although it must be said that by then, the March on Rome had already taken place. And so was born the first fascist government. It was followed by others in Spain, Portugal, and Germany. But the question is, what exactly did Mussolini do when he came to power? Well, this is where we come to the most bizarre part of the story. Overnight, Mussolini became a pro-liberalizer, and if you don't believe me, look at these statements made by the dictator himself.
The state must have a police, a judicial system, an army, and a foreign policy. All other things, and I do not exclude secondary education, must return to the private activity of individuals. We must put an end to the state which wastes the money of all Italian taxpayers and worsens the depleted finances of the Italian state.
Come on, with statements like these, Mussolini almost overtook Adam Smith on the right. But was the Duce really so interested in privatization and low taxes? Well, at least in front of the gallery, the answer is yes. The fascist government in its first years carried out what was probably the largest privatization package in history up until that time. And yes, these days, privatization is something relatively common. But believe me when I tell you that at the time, it was something completely extraordinary. To give you an idea, Mussolini put an end to the state monopoly on life insurance, on telecommunications. He privatized the state match company, a good handful of metallurgical companies. What's more, he tried to privatize the railroads, but the proposal didn't go through. And I know what you're thinking, was fascism a capitalist revolution? Well, obviously, no. If you remember, we have said that the fascists came to power by uniting the voters and the parties of the center and extreme right. That is, Mussolini was tied down by the bourgeoisie and his power was limited. On top of that, the Minister of Finance and Economy at that time was this man, Alberto Di Stefani, a politician from a centrist party who was basically a lifelong supporter of free market values. Stefani's obsession was to reduce the deficit, lower taxes, and public spending as well. He eliminated regulations and was responsible for privatizing scores of state-owned companies, many of which, by the way, were money pits rather than sources of wealth. Stefani, in fact, was a great technocrat who remained hidden in history. In just 2 years, Italy went from a deficit of 3 billion Italian lira to a surplus of 400 million. Now, as we say around here, the devil is in the details. Yes, De Stefani was a market-friendly politician, but even so, his influence was far smaller than it appears at first glance. To begin with, do you remember the privatizations? What we haven't told you is that most of them were hand-picked sales to big businessmen. And regarding the deficit, well, yes, he fixed the public accounts, but most of the adjustment came from cutting items from the First World War. So the question is, what on earth was Mussolini's role in all this? Well, the Duce thought that this capitalism was all very well to win votes and have the support of the bourgeoisie, but let's be clear, it was all a front. After a few years of moderation, pseudo-capitalism, and orderly accounts, the dictator managed to gain popularity and control a good part of Italy. Let's be clear, he no longer needed to be the bourgeoisie's little friend. So in 1925, he fired the good Di Stefani, and it was then that he was able to carry out his real objective, corporatism. Mussolini turned the Italian state into a huge bureaucratic apparatus that oversaw each and every sector of the economy. And be careful, we aren't talking about socialism here. Mussolini did not want to eliminate private property or plan the economy. What he wanted was to create corporations that would integrate businessmen, workers, and government representatives into a single entity to regulate the economy, resolve labor conflicts, and above all, be put at the service of the state. But what did this translate into on a day-to-day basis? In practice, this policy meant two things. On the one hand, to crush the trade unions, especially those of socialist origin, and on the other hand, extorting all workers to join a sort of single fascist trade union, which naturally was controlled by party members. Theoretically, workers were free not to join and even to form their own groups, but the law of April 1926 made it clear that in order to do so, they had to give their names, and all their group's assets could be confiscated overnight. In this way, the fascist government was able to control the working conditions of the workers. Now, unlike most political systems, corporatism did not seek to improve people's wages. Mussolini's model boosted business at the cost of worsening workers' wages. Remember, the goal was corporations and their service to the state. Wages were a secondary thing. The main thing was corporate development. For example, livestock handlers in the agreements went from earning 3,900 Italian lira a year to only 3,100. Likewise, carpenters went from 3.7 Italian lira an hour to 2.5 Italian lira an hour. This explains why whereby wages, particularly in the countryside, but also in industry, were reduced during the Duce era. After all, the fascist strategy was simple: lower wages and use the surplus money to boost industry. But take note, because Mussolini was not the only dictator to do something similar. In a future video on this channel, we will talk about how General Park in South Korea also suppressed the population in order to boost industry. However, Mussolini's case is very unusual. While South Korea punished not only workers, but also malfunctioning enterprises, Mussolini punished the population, but rescued enterprises that couldn't keep up. In 1932 alone, the government invested more than 8.5 billion Italian lira in bailouts, and the following year, the figure doubled. And where did the money come from? As always, from ordinary mortals, more specifically from the nationalized banks. The government took money from customers' deposits and lent it to companies. It is estimated that by 1933, the government directly or indirectly controlled 80% of the country's credit. And we're not only talking about bailouts. The big South Korean companies in Park's time were very well pampered, yes, but they were still private companies with the freedom to invest in innovative projects. In contrast, Italian companies were basically nests of civil servants, where no one did or took responsibility for anything.
A never-ending stream of officials passed through Mussolini's office each day to receive his orders, though he had no means of checking that his orders were carried out. Officials generally pretended to obey and took no action at all.
Of course, it didn't stop there. As good populists, the Italian fascists started spending money like crazy. They invested in public works and employment plans. And what about the armed forces? Well, just like Hitler did as soon as he came to power, Mussolini also invested up to 20% of the public budget in rearming the country. All of this explains why the deficit once again plunged the country's public finances. And let me ask you, what happens when the government goes into constant deficit? Well, either it continues until it goes bankrupt, or it makes cuts, or it increases taxes. I guess you'll see where this is going. Mussolini raised taxes. What's more, he not only raised them, he turned Italy into a veritable tax hell.
I am the first to proclaim that the tax burden has reached its final limit, and that the Italian taxpayer must be left, at least for some time, absolutely alone. If possible, we must even strive to lighten his burden if we do not want to find him crushed under its heavy burden.
Well, if we add to the higher human taxes the forced wage cuts we have already mentioned, Italian workers ended up losing between 50 and 70% of their income. Workers who, by the way, were practically forbidden to emigrate in search of a better life. In 1923 alone, with the Duce newly seated on the throne, some 270,000 people emigrated from Italy. But after 15 years with him in power, that figure was reduced to 1/10. Italy became a fiscal and labor prison at the service of the state. But Visualeconomik community, it is right here when the last plot twist in the story arrives: the crash of 1929. The crash of 29 was the biggest stock market crash in history. It started in the US, but soon after moved to Europe, becoming what we know today as the Great Depression. The Italian economy was greatly damaged. Agricultural unemployment doubled. Industrial production fell by 30%, and exports fell by a third by 1934. As if this were not enough, the Great Depression was compounded by Mussolini's terrible monetary management. And yes, here we say Mussolini's and not Italy's, because the Duce was a capricious man who would go against the advice of his experts. The fact is that the dictator believed he had found the magic formula for wealth: deflation. He thought that if prices went down, everyone would be richer. The problem is that with deflation, not only do prices fall, but wages, consumption, and investment also fall. But to put it another way, here we're talking about a phenomenon diametrically opposed to what has happened in Venezuela or Argentina. The government reduces the amount of money in circulation. Salaries and prices go down. Money has more and more value, and therefore people start to save in excess. This reduces consumption, companies lose sales, and lower prices to recover. But as prices go down, the spiral starts again. To give you an idea, the amount of banknotes in circulation fell from 21 billion lira to 16 billion lira in only 4 years. The outcome? Profound industrial stagnation.
Although calculated to enhance the country's prestige, Mussolini's monetary policy ushered in a period of serious deflation and industrial and commercial stagnation.
But as if all these problems were not enough, Mussolini had yet another obsession: autarky. That is, to produce everything domestically without depending on other countries. And so, in 1934, only businessmen with a special permit could import wood, oil, or copper. And in 1935, the Fascist Party established a monopoly, a single state-owned company authorized to import anything from coal to tin and nickel. But even so, Mussolini's plans did not stop there. If he wanted to achieve autarky, he needed Italy to start producing its own food. Because yes, although it may seem incredible, although today we are all familiar with the great agricultural power of regions such as Tuscany, during the fascist regime, Italy was a net importer of food. Or to put it another way, it did not even produce the food with which it fed itself. This is how the battle for grain began, in Mussolini's words, to free Italy from the slavery of foreign bread. We're talking about an attempt to boost wheat production with a mixture of labor repression, land nationalization, and rationalization of production. A party member would come to a village and explain to the farmers how best to plant wheat. The result? Well, judge for yourselves. Mussolini managed to increase production, but in a rather erratic way, so much so that by 1934, the figure was very similar to that of 1923. And that's without taking into account that Italy's population had grown by some 7 million inhabitants. The outcome? Homegrown bread ended up being much more expensive than imported bread. The dream of the fascists was that this sacrifice would serve to turn Italy into an industrial power. They envisioned a country with the most modern infrastructure and the most productive enterprises, but the results they achieved were mediocre at best. And remember, it wasn't for lack of trying. Some authors estimate that in 1939, Italy was second in the world for being the country with more state-owned companies, or directly at the service of the Duce, behind only the Soviet Union. In his defense, Mussolini claimed that he had also increased social spending. But the truth is that, with the exception of a couple of specific programs, such as support for women in childbirth, most of them either never arrived or delivered a pittance. The National Solidarity Fund, one of the most extensive programs that helped 1,750,000 families, distributed only 5 cents a day per person. And be careful, because a day means only on winter days. To give more context, in January 1935 alone, New York spent the equivalent of 200 million lira on social aid, compared to the 130 million lira spent throughout the whole of Italy in a single year. And from those 130 million must be subtracted all that was lost to corruption and bureaucracy. In short, Mussolini's corporatist state took property from the entrepreneurs, exploited the workers, and despite all the propaganda, did not provide relief to the poor. Everything was done to industrialize the country and build the most modern infrastructure, but none of it ended up increasing the standard of living of Italians. But at this point, it's your turn. How much did you know about Mussolini's Italy? What economic lessons can be drawn from this? Did the Duce's policies remind you more of Hitler or Franco? You can leave me your answers down in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel, hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like the video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you next time.